A woman named Mrs. Ning is having an eye operation. Her husband Jack is a successful heart surgeon. The doctor tells him that his wife will be blind temporarily for 3 days. Jack plays and teases his wife because she couldn't see him, and they are having fun together. Their house helper named May is doing the laundry when a man sneaks in. It turns out to be a cop who is courting May. He invites her to a concert, but she asks him to do a favor first. She gives him a film from her boss and asks him to have it developed. Jack tells his wife that he will be attending a conference in Macau. He promises he will be back before she can even see. Jack later left, and when Mrs. Ning goes back to the living room, she accidentally sits on the wireless phone, and she just slips it away. A while later, May tells Mrs. Ning that she needs to go out to buy medicine for her asthma. She says she'd be back soon. Then she left, leaving Mrs. Ning alone. While spending time with her dog outside, her furry companion suddenly runs away. But fortunately, a man named Sam catches him and ties him to his doghouse. He introduces himself and says he is looking for Dr. Jack. Sam says he came to thank Jack for curing his wife who had a heart attack. He also reveals that he and Jack went to primary school together. Mrs. Ning invites Sam to come in, and he helps her get inside. Sam does not want to stay much longer, so he leaves. It's already dark, and Mrs. Ning had fallen asleep. It starts raining, and May hasn't come back yet. A while later, someone rings the doorbell, and she thought it's May, but it turns out to be Sam, saying he was not able to get a taxi. She lets him come in, and lets him borrow Jack's clothes from their room. Sam later talks about how much he loves his wife, but then he says his wife hates his job in the printing factory, saying he has no future in it. He starts ranting and talking loudly, which makes Mrs. Ning scared. Upon realizing his actions, he promptly apologizes. Mrs. Ning notices that the rain has stopped, and Sam says he will leave now. When he left, the blind wife goes to get a juice in the kitchen. She has a strange feeling that someone is following her, but then realizes it must have been just her imagination. Mrs. Ning goes to take a bath, and it turns out that Sam is with her in the shower. She does not notice him until Sam accidentally spurts out water on her, which makes the blind lady panic. A while later, as Mrs. Ning is going out of the bathroom, Sam comes running, pretending to fight off the intruder who went inside her house. He later tells her that the thief escaped. Sam prepares milk for Mrs. Ning and puts some sleeping pills on it. While he is gone, Mrs. Ning locks the door and tries to use the telephone, but it turns out that the wires have been cut off. Moments later, she falls asleep. She wakes up next morning with Sam eating on her bed. He invites her for breakfast, but Mrs. Ning insists on going to the police first. To make her at peace, Sam uses the telephone to call the police. Mrs. Ning remembers that the telephone was not working, and it finally dawns on her that Sam is the bad guy throughout. Mrs. Ning threatens that her husband will be back soon, but Sam, who has been planning this for a year, knows that Jack won't be back for 2 days. He also reveals that he has May tied up in the trunk of his car. The blind lady tries to run away, but all the doors are locked. Sam later teases Mrs. Ning, asking her inappropriate questions, like if she ever played with herself. When he starts making advances on her, Mrs. Ning grabs a metal rod to hit him, but Sam manages to snatch it, and as punishment, he bites her neck very hard and leaves her crying. A while later, Sam brings her to lunch and tells her to eat the steak. She savors it, but then, Sam tells her that it is her dog she's eating. Mrs. Ning vomits in disgust, but Sam still forces her to eat. Mrs. Ning vomits in the bathroom, and later on breaks everything while crying hard. She later tells herself to calm down, and goes back to her bedroom. Sam approaches her, and starts bragging about his wife again, but then he says one day he found out that his wife had another man. He later tells Mrs. Ning to massage him, and while watching TV, the lady serves him food like a king. A while later, Mrs. Ning starts to have an asthma attack, and she asks for the medicine in May's bag, so he goes to take it. The inhaler no longer works, so Sam has to go out and buy a new one. Before leaving, he locks her up, but he did not notice that Mrs. Ning stuck her dress in the door. When Sam left, Mrs. Ning goes out of the room healthy because she was just pretending her asthma. She checks her keys, but Sam has broken all of them. She remembers the phone she slipped on the couch, but when she tries to call the police, it turns off, running out of battery. She feels hopeless until she remembers the charger upstairs. As she is climbing the stairs, Mrs. Ning hears the car approaching. She hurriedly goes back and accidentally falls down the stairs. In panic, she injects the battery inside her, just in time as before Sam sees it. Without suspicion, Sam helps her get back to her room to rest. When he's gone, Mrs. Ning takes out the battery and puts it in the charger. That evening, Sam confronts her because he finds out from the medical card that the asthma medicine was for May and not for her. He is about to assault her when Mrs. Ning mentions his wife. That is when Sam reveals that the other man of his wife is her own doctor, Jack, Mrs. Ning's husband. Sam says he let their affair for 2 years because his wife needs the doctor for her disease, but when she eventually died of heart attack, that is when Sam gets mad. He wants to exact revenge by doing the same affair to the doctor's wife. Mrs. Ning does not believe it, but the psycho man tells her that the truth will be revealed when her husband comes back. Sam goes out to have a smoke, and incidentally, a burglar breaks into the house. She tries to hit him with the umbrella, but fails to do so. Figuring out that she's blind, the burglar ties her in the bed. Mrs. Ning tries to warn him about Sam, but the burglar ignores her. As he makes his advances, Sam arrives and beats him up. He puts banana in his mouth to stop him from shouting, and then he cuts the burglar's rod until he passes out. Just then, someone rings the bell. It turns out to be the cop who comes to pick up May for the concert. Sam pretends to be Dr. Jack. The cop notices the blood on Sam's finger, so he smiles and asks to come in. He requests for a drink, and while Sam is away, the officer goes upstairs to check. Sam catches him, and he lets the cop see the bedroom, saying his wife is sleeping, although it is actually the unconscious burglar under the sheet. When the cop leaves, Mrs. Ning, who is tied, manages to get out of the closet. She tries to scream, but it's too late as the officer has already left. She later gets a grab of a foil cutter in the kitchen, and gets to cut the ropes. She runs outside, and this time, her sight is slowly coming back, although she can just barely see a small light through the road. She manages to run far away, and when she sees 2 lights indicating a car, Mrs. Ning runs towards it. She gets in, and upon hearing a female voice, Mrs. Ning asks for her help while holding her hands. It turns out that Sam uses May's body and changes his voice to sound like a lady. While driving, the cop remembers the photos of May's boss that she asked him to develop, but then he sees Mr. Jack and realizes that the man in the house is not him, so he hurriedly goes back. Upon arriving, the officer hears a commotion, and he quietly sneaks in. He sees Mrs. Ning in the bathroom, and gets distracted that he did not hear Sam behind him. Sam pulls a knife and stabs the cop multiple times until he perishes. Now with a gun, Sam brings Mrs. Ning in the living room where he forcibly gropes her. This time, Mrs. Ning gives in, so that Sam would be distracted and drop the gun in the couch. She tries to grab for it, but she can't reach the gun. Jack suddenly arrives, interrupting the two. Sam pretends that he is Mrs. Ning's lover, and Jack gets mad. He kicks Sam multiple times, and then scolds his wife for cheating on him. Sam then shoots Jack's legs, and points the gun at him, while making the doctor admit his affair with Sam's wife. When Jack confesses the affair, Sam beats him up. Although blurry, Mrs. Ning starts to see better, so she hits Sam with a fire poker, but it does not stop him, and he continues to beat Jack. Mrs. Ning goes to turn off all the lights, and starts grabbing things she needs for her plan. She burns Sam's face using a lighter and spray, then she runs away. She puts butane bottles inside the microwave and sets the timer. Just as Sam arrives, Mrs. Ning closes the door. Few seconds later, the microwave explodes, knocking Sam out. Thinking that it is safe, Mrs. Ning comes out, but then Sam grabs her legs and chokes her. She reaches for the fire poker and stabs Sam. Mrs. Ning finally feels relieved. She then sees her husband calling her and apologizing. Mrs. Ning is so mad and could not forgive him. She is puzzled because her husband seems unconscious, so she draws near him, but then Sam suddenly appears. She's no longer afraid this time, and she fights back, hitting Sam multiple times, until he is finally done for good. Weeks later, we can see Mrs. Ning walking gorgeously through the city. When a man tries to cut her in the taxi and mocks her, Mrs. Ning hits him in the groins and tells him to never fight with women. Did you like our movie recap? Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. To be updated for new movie recaps, hit the notification bell.